Hello everyone, today we're going to be starting a series on Francisco Suarez's Disputationes Metaphysicae, part 5, which is on individuation, on the principle of individuation. And today we'll be doing section 1, whether all things that exist or can exist are singular and individual. First, some preliminaries. What are universals? Universals, hypothetically, are things which exist in multiple places, or at the very least seem to, such as humanity or the color red. There's a red book over here, there's a red book over there, there's red blood, there's red flowers. They all seem to have this red thing in common. It seems to be universal, which exists in multiple places. The same goes with humanity. I'm a human, you're a human, hypothetically at least. This is largely a series for my interest because I want to get a little deeper into this topic, and he summarizes essentially the entire history of conversation on the subject, at least from the scholastic point of view. And finally, why doesn't he address Scotus's opinion in his disputation? Well, according to Suarez, Scotus is tackling a different problem from him that has to do strictly with why a thing is indivisible and not why it is different from everything else. It's a very subtle distinction that you'd have to get into the literature to fully understand. But there is an explanation for why he never covers Scotus's answer to the principle of individuation. Okay, section 1. Whether all things that exist or can exist are singular and individual. Part 1, Objections. First, the divine essence. The divine essence is shared among the persons of the Trinity. That kind of seems to imply that you can have multiple things which have this essence in common, which would function as universal. The second is the unity of angels. Angels have essential but not numerical unity. That is to say that angels, there's only one angel in each species of angel. It would be like if there could only possibly be one human in all of humanity. There's only one angel in each species of angel. And this means they have essential unity, but there's also this thing called numerical unity, where it's the unity of a thing inside a species. So, Peter is a human and Paul is a human, and they both have this numerical unity, which is the unity of them as members of the species and individuals in it, not as the entire species. But angels only have essential and not numerical unity. This means they're already abstract, similar to your conception of man or humanity. In your mind, you have this idea of man, which you can't multiply. It's already abstract. It already applies to every existing man. Your idea of humanity does. And then finally, the argument from the common nature. Peter and Paul both have humanity. To be possessed by many is to be universal and not singular. Therefore, humanity is universal and not singular. Now we have arguments for Suarez's position after we looked at those arguments against it. His only argument he gives in this section is actually just that Aristotle said so. It's literally just that. I don't know why he bothered. He has other arguments later which are more interesting, but in the section which is supposed to present his arguments for his position, he just says Aristotle said this against Plato. Now we have the solution to the question, which is Suarez's analysis of unity. There is a common idea of man, which is applicable to all men. And then there's this thing called the negation of communicability or division. So the unity of a numerically distinct individual, that is to say like Peter instead of Paul, their unity is a negation or a lack of communicability or division. It's not a positive thing in itself. It's a lack of a different thing. At least that's how Suarez says it. Later he'll say that you need a positive thing to account for this lack. But for now it's just a lack. And then finally he gives us this definition here. Unity is entity undivided with itself and divided from everything else. That is to say that it is itself and it is not all of the other things that exist. Now we have two quick objections. One is that of accidental or conceptual unities, which seem to have this property. Think of a heap of stones. The heap of stones is undivided with itself and divided from everything else. But what's missing here is the idea of entity and essential unity. The heap of stones only exists as an individual thing inside a person's mind. Their mind constructs the idea of the heap as a full thing, but it's made up of many individual things. So these are not common. These are either mental constructs or single individual things. And then another objection is that water is divisible into many things, all of which are still water. This is an idea of a homogeneous whole, where you have a whole and each of the parts are made up of the same kind of thing as the whole is. This is actually contrasted with a heterogeneous whole, where, think of like a human. If you took a human and you cut them into little pieces, all of the little pieces would not also be humans. But if you took a bucket of water and you separated it into 3 different buckets that were all smaller, it would still all be water. But this isn't really a problem for Suarez's position, because water, the divided water would no longer be the same thing as the water unified. So there wouldn't be any universals. Then we come to the solution to the specific question that's asked in this chapter, and that is that all things that exist or can exist immediately are singular and individual. Now, something important to note here is the word immediately. There are universal things which exist by singular mediation. So if you think of humanity as an idea is a universal. And if it wasn't attached to something else, a singularity, that is what Suarez calls it, if it wasn't attached to a singularity, then it would be universal. However, universals can't exist, so it needs to be attached to a singularity. And now all things that exist or can exist immediately, without mediation, are singular and individual. Then Suarez has this extended argument against Platonism. If humanity is universal, then either 1, it is in both Peter and Paul, or 2, it is entirely distinct from Peter and Paul. If 2, then the universal is already a distinct individual, thing which is already a particular, and Peter and Paul are not technically human. That is to say that if it's not Peter and Paul, if it's entirely distinct from them, then it's just a singular thing. If number 1, then it's either identical in both of them, it's the same thing in both of them, or it's distinct from both of them. If A, then they're both actually one man and thus particular, Peter and Paul are the same person. Or if B, then either it collapses into 2 from earlier, or humanity is both singular and universal at the same time. But if it was singular and universal at the same time, then it would have contradictory properties and thus be impossible. Now, I think that the best route for a Platonist to take is just to bite the bullet on 2 and say that humanity is something which is distinct and individual or distinct from the individuals, which are Peter and Paul, which would make it a kind of individual which is capable of being located in multiple places, which is neither Peter nor Paul. But that has a lot of weird consequences, which you could read about in, say, Rob Kuhn's paper, Forms as Individual Grounds, or Simple Grounds of Common Natures. Then we have his responses to objections. To the first objection, the divine nature is actually just a singular thing. the trinity of supposits in the common nature does not cause a trinity of individual essences. Second, angels are more singular. They're extra singular. They're more singular than humans. Humans have this added feature which allows them to be distinguished into individuals, but angels are they're essentially individuals, at least according to Suarez. And finally, the humanity of each individual human is individual. So when you have the argument for Platonism, or the argument from the common nature is what I called it, Suarez just says that there's like this type which it can exist multiple different times, but the type isn't identical to all the other members of the type. So the humanity of each individual human, like Paul's humanity and Peter's humanity, are individual things in and of themselves. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. And also one last thing, actually, these videos are going to take a little bit longer to come out because Suarez is much harder to read than the other scholastics and is much more dense, so it's going to take me longer to make these. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed.